everyone. Thank you for joining us for the last Climate Live K12 session of the 2023-2024 academic year. This is a video series brought to you by the Columbia Climate School that is really targeted towards students, educators, and the public. My name is Laurel Zaimashihi, and I am the Assistant Director of K12 and Continuing Education at the Columbia Climate School. I'll be facilitating today's session with my colleague Nishat Mirza. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Columbia Climate School or are joining us for the first time, we are a newly established school at Columbia University for transdisciplinary climate research. The school marshals the university's strengths and basic and applied disciplines and expands its resources to understand climate and its impact on society, developing and inspiring knowledge-based solutions, and educating future leaders for just and prosperous societies on a healthy planet. The Climate School is the first new school at Columbia in over 25 years, and it incorporates more than 20 different centers that collaborate across Columbia. So what we're hoping to do with these Climate Live K12 sessions is to introduce you to the work through our scientific experts. These are monthly sessions that run throughout the academic year. This year, this session in June will be our last one, so we'll restart again in the fall. But if you have any interest in looking at our old Climate Live sessions, they are all recorded and on our website that will be put in the chat and on our YouTube page. If you have any questions about future or past sessions, you can also email me. We'll put that email in the chat as well. It's learn@climate.columbia.edu. Each week we focus on different topics and they are directed toward a certain age range. So for today's session, we're going to be focusing on the myths and misconceptions of renewable energy. So there is an alarming amount of data that has really begun to emerge that this misinformation is eroding support for renewable energy development in parts of the country. So in today's session, Matt Eisenson from the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law is going to describe where this misinformation is coming from and analyze some of the common misconceptions about wind, solar, and electric vehicles. During this session, we welcome all questions, but you'll notice that the chat is disabled. So please use the Q&A box to ask questions at any point during the session, and we'll have time to answer them at the end. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Matt Eisenson.
Yeah, thanks, Laurel, for having me. I'm going to pull up a few slides and we can talk about this report that we published in April. All right, great. So I'm going to talk about a report that we published this year called Rebutting 33 False Claims About Solar, Wind, and Electric Vehicles. And first, I want to give you a little bit of context about why we did this. So at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, I'm an environmental lawyer. We're all lawyers at the Sabin Center. It's an academic center at Columbia Law School. My research is focused on overcoming legal obstacles to getting wind and solar projects approved. What we've seen in the course of researching these obstacles is that there's often a lot of local opposition to projects, and that this opposition is often using a lot of misinformation. But first, I wanted to give you a little bit of context about where we are in the energy transition. I'm sure most of you are aware that we are in the middle of a pretty dramatic energy transition. This is a graph of the total amount, the cumulative amount of solar that's been deployed in the United States from 2010 to 2024. So I graduated from college in 2009, worked at NRDC for 3 years. When I graduated, there was basically no solar in the United States. There was almost no utility scale solar deployed anywhere. And by the time I left NRDC in 2012, there was maybe about 10,000 megawatts. Now we have about 200,000. So since 2012, we have about 20 times more solar than we had before. And if you look at this graph, the top piece here, the light blue, it's utility scale solar PV. So these are solar panels in open spaces. There's also a fair amount of residential and commercial. The dark blue and yellow would be like rooftop solar panels largely. Why did this happen? In 2009, 2010, 2011, the thinking was that we would never have a lot of renewable energy deployed in the United States unless there were a carbon tax or cap and trade, which would make fossil fuels more expensive and allow, wind and solar to compete. What actually happened was there was a dramatic decline in price, both of wind and solar. So you have here the price of solar modules over time. In 2011, it was about $1.54 per watt. And, as of last summer, it was about 20 cents per watt. Absolutely incredible decline in price. You see a little increase between 2020 and 2022 with inflation, but it's leveled off and come back down again. So basically what that means is that the economics of wind and solar are good enough now that we really can deploy enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But what's standing in the way right now? One of the things that's standing in the way right now is there's a huge amount of local opposition. So what we see is that very often when a large wind or solar project is approved, there will be 10 or 12 people in the community who really don't want it to happen. These are often, neighbors who live near the project site, and they usually just don't want to look at it. So they will form an opposition group, start a website, and start to organize against it. The Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, which is part of the US Department of Energy, had a really interesting study that was published in January of this year. And they surveyed about 120 developers of wind and solar projects and asked, how are these projects going? How many of them are you canceling? How many are getting delayed? And they found that, at least 30% of the projects are getting canceled after an application for a site has been submitted. And the situation was a bit worse for wind than for solar. And they asked, what are the leading causes of cancellation? The three leading causes here are, local ordinances and zoning. So these are, restrictive ordinances where counties or townships will say, if you want to build a wind turbine, fine, but it needs to be 1 mile from the nearest road. Restrictions that make it almost impossible to build. Grid interconnection. This is more of a technical problem of congestion. We need to build more transmission before we can link all these things up. And community opposition. So community opposition and local ordinances and zoning are very closely related. And so 2 out of the top 3 reasons that we're seeing projects being canceled are because of local opposition. A few other interesting things in the survey. The developers, the Berkeley Lab asked the developers, how often are different types of concerns coming up when people are opposing wind or solar projects? And what they found is that there is a long list of concerns that people will raise. People will talk about visual impacts, property value impacts, sound, community character, loss of agricultural land, health effects, local environment, wildlife. It's a long list. But when they ask developers, what do you think is actually the root cause of the opposition? It's a much shorter list. In most instances, it's these top ones: visual impacts, community character, residential property values, loss of agricultural land, sound for wind, and then some of these other things like local environment and wildlife impacts drop down to almost nothing. I mentioned that it's very common for opponents of wind and solar projects to organize and to create websites to oppose projects. This is an example of a website called notosolar.com that was created by anti-solar activists in Michigan. If you look at the top, there's a tab that says how solar affects you. If you click on it, you see all sorts of claims that are misinformation. So the first one here, solar panels emit a substantial amount of heat, which negatively affects the environment. It's possible, or it is likely, that solar farms are making climate change worse. Another claim you see is that developing solar projects on agricultural land poses a serious threat to the food supply. There's this sort of rhetorical question here. If agricultural land is developed into solar farms, who's going to feed our community, our country, and our world? And then there's this last one that gets to health concerns. The electromagnetic fields from solar farms pose serious health risks, especially to those who have electromagnetic hypersensitivity. These are all completely false claims. And we'll talk about them more specifically. As Laurel mentioned in her introduction, we are starting to see some evidence that these false claims are having an impact on public opinion. And the most clear evidence that we've seen so far is in New Jersey with respect to offshore wind. So Monmouth University did some polling last summer, and they found that there had been a massive decline in support for offshore wind in New Jersey. If you look at the graph on the left, you'll see that in July 2008, about 82% of people in New Jersey supported offshore wind and only 12% opposed it. Fast forward to August 2023, and it was 54% support, 40% oppose. When they look at who opposes it, a majority of those who oppose offshore wind now believe that offshore wind is causing whale deaths. And there's been a concerted campaign to tie whale deaths to offshore wind, and there's really no evidence that offshore wind exploration is causing whale deaths. So this, all of this misinformation prompted us to publish this report, which goes through 33 false claims. The purpose of the report is not to say that wind and solar, won't have any adverse impacts at all. It's instead to look at, what are the claims out there that are false, and why do we know they're false? So I think we'll walk through a few individual claims.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I mean, when I talk to professionals in the field or my students, I often hear some of these that were written in the report. One of them being that electromagnetic fields from solar farms are actually harmful to our human health. And I'd love to hear more about that, if that's true. Like, where does this misinformation come from?
Yeah, this is a good one to start with because some of the claims in our report are really just overstatements, or they fail to look at ways that impacts can be avoided or reduced. This one is just purely false. So the electromagnetic fields from solar farms, an electromagnetic field it's a synonym for radiation. Radiation sounds bad, but the levels of radiation or electromagnetic fields are very, very small. So the accepted exposure limit is about 2,000 milligauss. And if you are, 9 feet away from a residential inverter, and the inverter is the part of the solar panel system that has the highest electromagnetic fields. So if you're 9 feet away from a rooftop solar system, the exposure is 0.5 milligauss. This is well under 2,000, and it's even far below the average background level of 1. If you're holding an electric can opener, you're at 1,500 milligauss. And if you're standing right next to the biggest inverter at a commercial solar farm, it's about 1,000. So this is just it's pure misinformation. And one other thing to say about the type of electromagnetic fields that you get at solar farms is that it's called non-ionizing radiation, which means that there's enough energy to move molecules, and moving molecules is just creating heat. So there's enough energy coming out of these electromagnetic fields to create a little bit of heat, but not enough to ionize or remove electrons. So any sort of damage to DNA is impossible at this sort of level of energy.
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay. I'm also surprised to see that my electric can opener is causing me more levels of radiation. I might need to get rid of that.
Well, I mean, even that is, well below the accepted exposure limit. But it
That's
is
true.
interesting. Yeah.
Is that on a daily rate?
I think it's instantaneous.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Another one that I've just been seeing a lot in the news actually, is that solar projects are actually reducing the agricultural production, which is hurting farmers in rural communities. And, another argument that I'm hearing is like with climate change, there's already going to be a food scarcity issue. So could these solar projects actually contribute towards that food scarcity?
Yeah. So this comes up a lot, and this is one where I think a lot of people who bring up the argument genuinely are concerned about agricultural production, and they wonder, is this a good use of farmland? But there are a few things to say. One is that we have a lot of farmland in the United States. We have about 900 million acres, and the most wildly ambitious scenarios for solar development would require about 10 million acres. So we're talking about around 1%. But not every solar farm is being built on farmland. Farmland is often an easy place to develop because you want big open spaces, and farmland tends to be big open spaces. But a lot is going into deserts too. There will be solar farms on degraded land as well. But really, even if you're doing it on farmland, we have enough space. Another thing to point out is that so much of our farmland right now is not even being used for food production. We grow about 90 million acres of corn every year, and about 45% of the corn is used for ethanol production. Other countries, might not have as much farmland as the United States, but even if you look at a country like the UK, solar is just not going to take up a big percentage, even on a net zero trajectory. Here you see on the left total UK land, and then we look at this one box. It represents 1% of the UK's land. Most of that 1% is golf courses, and then you see the bottom layer there is the current amount of solar, and the light yellow is the future amount of solar you need to get towards net zero. So we have enough land, even in countries like the UK, to do this. And there's going to be, more land taken up by golf courses than solar. The one other thing to say is that there have been pretty big advances over the last couple years in agrivoltaics and dual use of land. So it's not really a zero-sum game. There are some things that are relatively easy to do, like grazing sheep under solar panels, or adding pollinator habitat, honeybee habitat. There are some things that are a little harder, like growing crops, but it's starting to be done at scale.
Oh, that's really exciting. And it's funny because on a much smaller scale, my mom's neighbor has residential solar panels in their large plot at their home, and they have like goats and different animals grazing underneath. I thought they were just looking for shade in the hot summer sun, but I think there's like a larger scale benefit that could be kind of like played off of that too.
Absolutely.
So another one that I hear very often, and I think there are some solutions to this, but that wind turbines are a major threat to birds and bats, especially like during their migratory times. Yeah, I would love to hear more about this because I heard about some solutions, but I'm not sure about how effective they are.
Yeah. So I think here, I'd first like to contextualize it because there are some bird deaths related to wind turbines, but climate change is a much bigger threat right now. So the National Audubon Society, which takes climate change very seriously, has done this incredible series that looks at how will climate change affect the ranges, the breeding ranges of various birds. And so you have a bird like the American goldfinch will lose about 65% of its current breeding range with 3 degrees of warming. You have this whole area that's in red here will be lost. So you won't have goldfinches anymore in Virginia or Illinois or California. They will get some new breeding grounds up in the blue areas here in Alaska. But climate change will cause major shifts. And it looks a lot worse for the birds that are already breeding in the Arctic. So there's a very common shorebird right now called the semi-palmated sandpiper, and you would never know that it was endangered because it's a pretty big population still. But this red area where it breeds, it's going to lose all of that red, so 91% of its breeding range, largely due to increasing sea levels. And then there are just these little fragments, about 9% of its current range would be retained up in the Arctic. So that's the climate change side of the equation. And then on the other side of the equation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has done some analysis of what are the relative causes of mortality of birds, and found that as of 2013, 2014, collisions with wind turbines were causing about 200 to 300,000 deaths per year, while cats were causing 2.4 billion deaths. This study, the obvious rebuttal here is that there were a lot fewer wind turbines in 2014 than there are today. But even if there were 10 times as many turbines now, which there aren't, you'd be looking at 2 million deaths, as opposed to 72 million for poisoning. So it's something that we should absolutely try to minimize, and there are ways to do it. The most obvious one is with sighting. When birds migrate, they're often flying at pretty high altitude, and the only times they'll come down to the level of where the wind turbines are is when they're looking for food or looking to rest for the night. So if there's really good habitat for resting, like wetlands nearby or trees, that could be an issue. But if the wind turbines are sited far enough from the places that they're likely to be coming down or taking off from, a lot of deaths can be avoided.
Yeah, absolutely. I've also heard as a solution that you can paint one of the blades a different color, and it significantly reduces bird deaths. Have you heard about that as a solution?
Yeah, that's shown some early promise, painting the blades and even the turbine, even the tower. I think there's a lot more study that needs to be done. And I should add that the wind turbines do appear to be a bigger issue for bats than they are for birds, but some of the same technologies are being explored. And a big technological intervention for both of them is curtailment. Cameras to help detect when birds or bats are too close, the turbines can stop.
Oh, wow. That's really exciting. I didn't know about that. And I didn't know they could stop that quickly. Great. So, kind of staying on the same idea of this renewable energy impacting wildlife. I've heard that offshore wind developments can be harmful to whales and other marine life through like the development. The pile driving can impact their echolocation as well as like the boat traffic. Does this hold any ground?
Yeah, so we have not seen any evidence that offshore wind development is causing whale deaths. The two leading anthropogenic causes of whale deaths are vessel strikes, which cause about 75% of the deaths, and entanglements in fishing gear, which are about 25%. So lobster traps can be a big issue. Offshore wind development it accounts for sort of a tiny percentage of the amount of vessel traffic. And a more likely explanation for the uptick in whale deaths has been that there's been a big increase in container ship traffic. A few important things to point out with offshore wind development are that one, there's been no construction yet in New Jersey. It's only exploratory activities. And sonar is used during exploration, but the level of sonar is less intense than what's used for oil and gas exploration. Another thing is that the developers of offshore wind projects have been entering into agreements with environmental organizations to limit impacts. So for the Vineyard Wind projects, they entered into an agreement with NRDC and other groups, promising to limit pile driving to certain months when the whales wouldn't be present, and to limit vessel speeds in the project area into the future.
Oh, wow. I'm glad to hear that these renewable projects are partnering and working with these environmental groups, because I think that these solutions can really reduce the amount of harm that could happen to wildlife here.
Yeah, me too.
So shifting towards electric vehicles now, some people claim that they have a net harmful effect on the climate, which is interesting. And I think most people relate it to the fact that you have to use these batteries that are very resource intensive. There's a lot of materials that go into these EVs. So is it more harmful than good?
No. So yeah, this is often presented as a gotcha. It's like, you think that EVs are so good for the environment, but don't you know that the batteries or components are produced in China, using power from coal plants? there have been so many life cycle analyses of electric vehicles and combustion engine cars. And in almost every scenario, EVs have a much smaller greenhouse gas impact. And this is true even with the fact that we have a lot of fossil fuels still powering our grid in the US. And if you look here, the total impact per mile of a gas car is a little over 350 grams per mile, whereas the EV is around 150 grams per mile. This discrepancy is going to get much bigger over time. As on the EV side, it's just going to drop. It's going to drop so much as we switch to renewable energy on the grid. It'll get down to about 97% less once we're at 100% carbon-free energy.
Wow, that's incredible. I've also heard that there is a really great ability to recycle these batteries. Like even long after the electric vehicle is no longer working, there is still an ability to recycle that battery. So there are it seems like some solutions that are here, and like these solutions are just growing.
Yeah, we're having a lot. There have been a lot of improvements in battery recycling for sure. So I think one last one here.
Yes, this is our last one, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone because I know we have a bunch. So are electric vehicles practical because they have these range restrictions, right? And sometimes they're limited if it's too hot or too cold. So how practical are they?
Yeah, so I think there are really two concerns with range restrictions. The first concern is how far will the battery take you? And the second concern is, will there be charging stations? And these are, very reasonable things to worry about. But there's good news on both fronts in that they're both just getting better. So the average range for an electric vehicle has increased substantially since 2018. We now have the average electric vehicle as of 2022 was getting 200 miles per charge, and there are plenty of models that get over 300 miles per charge. The second piece of this concern about range restrictions is, are there going to be enough charging stations? We finally started to install charging stations at a much faster rate, and we're going to need to keep it up for a while. But there's money in the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law to expand these charging stations. And I think we're going to see it happen.
Yeah, I have also, taken some deep dives into the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's a ton of money set aside for the growth of EVs in the US. So I think some of these issues are only going to become less of a concern as research and development just continues, which is great, and infrastructure. We have a ton of questions in the chat, so we'll try and get through as many as possible. If it's okay to go over a little bit from 4:30, if that's okay with you, Matt.
Yeah, sure.
So this is a great question from Anita. Are there any false claims that are paid for, supported by fossil fuel industries?
Yes. So it wasn't the focus of our report. We were focused more on the substance of the claims. But Timmons Roberts, professor at Brown University, has done a fair amount of research in the offshore wind context and has found that there's substantial links to fossil fuel related groups. And one place that we've seen it is in the lawsuits against the Vineyard Wind projects. As I mentioned, there were a number, the Vineyard Wind developers had entered into agreements with environmental groups before the project was completed. So there were no environmental groups that brought lawsuits, but there were lawsuits against the project brought by fishing industry groups and others. And one of the fishing industry groups was receiving pro bono legal representation from a fossil fuel aligned think tank.
Yeah, I had a similar question and had kind of been chatting with some folks that also were sharing the same sentiments that, behind a couple layers, the fossil fuel industry was there to support. We have a question from Lewis from Los Angeles. I would like to get this report or research data Can we provide the links? Yes, we can. So I can answer that one too. Lewis, I can share the report, which is now published in the show notes of our YouTube recording of this video. So it will be accessible to everyone because there are 33 false claims, right, Matt? So there's a lot to read.
That's right.
Awesome. So Robert asks, the answer is probably obvious, but why do people oppose solar farms and how? Is it disinformation, lies from the fossil fuel industry, or is it some human resistance to new ideas, or doing something differently, or a combination of multiple things?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think that there's always a number of people who are concerned about the visual impact. It might be the neighbors who live closest and they are used to looking across at an open field. We see it a lot in places like Ohio and Michigan, where people will move out of the city to a rural town and they really like the open fields. And they might not really appreciate how hard it is for farmers to break even. And so when a farmer gets an opportunity to enter a lease for a solar project, it's often very attractive, and they'll be very excited about the opportunity to lease out their land for a project. But then their neighbors will organize opposition to it because they don't want to look at it. There is also misinformation, and there are concerns that that are just sort of outdated. Like, people are concerned that solar is so uneconomical that the project will be half built and then abandoned if the subsidies dry up. And that's just really based on this 20 years outdated information about how solar panels were so expensive. But it's a combination of misinformation and concerns about things like visual impacts.
Yeah, that graph was kind of stunning to see how much visual impact really weighed in on people's opposition. So we have a question from Diana. Diana is also very surprised that 2 billion birds are killed by cats annually. Yeah, keep your cats inside or put little bells on them. She also asks, if offshore wind development takes off, what is the extrapolated number of possible whale deaths and marine life? I don't know if you'll know that exact number, but could it be enough cause for more resistance?
Yeah, so there's a lot of attention on the North Atlantic right whale because the population is so small. And if you look at it's about 300 individuals. If you look at the environmental impact statement for these projects are always, they're big enough that the federal government does a full scale, thousands of pages long environmental impact statement for each one. If you look at it, they will say that there may be, I think it's called a category B take, which means, non-lethal harassment, that, right whales could be bothered during construction. They could be annoyed, but the federal government is anticipating that none will be killed and that none will even be injured. But they still will, say in their conclusions that there could be one of these lower level takes of annoyance and temporary displacement.
Oh, that's really interesting. Kind of on that similar note, someone's asking, is fishing and using nets, like trawling or purse seines, are those allowed in offshore wind project areas? And I wonder if that question is related to if that number could then get skewed and make it seem like it was because of the wind farm, when in actuality it could have been from, fishing.
Yeah, so my understanding is that in the US, so there's not a lot of offshore wind development yet. There's a lot in the pipeline, but only a few big projects have actually been built. My understanding is that the fishing industry is allowed to operate in most of these areas. In other places, like in Europe, there are big no-go zones in offshore wind farms. But generally in the US, the fishermen are allowed to operate in the project area. A reason that they oppose the projects is because of slightly increased risk of collision with turbines, or slightly increased risk of their nets getting caught in the scour at the base of the turbines. It just makes things a little bit more inconvenient, and there might be a concern that will go the way of Europe and eventually not allow it. But I don't know if there's any basis for that concern. Yeah.
And what is the reason why Europe doesn't allow it? Is it because of the fear of running into the turbines?
I don't know exactly, but I think it might be because of not wanting to disrupt the cable. There's a
Oh,
cable on the ocean floor um,
that would
that
make
you
a lot of
wouldn't want
sense.
to, pull up by accident.
Yeah, especially with like bottom trawling. I could see that being an issue.
Yeah.
Okay. So Imani's asking, how are the new battery technologies close to how are the new battery technologies close to adoption? Will the new battery technologies be more fuel efficient?
Yeah, I mean, there have been just massive improvements in battery technology. I think storage and solar have had huge improvements over the last few years, both of them. I know that there's, in our report we talk about some, alternatives to using, critical metals. I think those are still sort of at an earlier stage, but they're being deployed in China. And, in China, we're seeing like ultra cheap electric vehicles that aren't going to be in the U.S. market for because of tariffs. But it's yeah, the innovations in battery technology are here now.
Yeah, I agree. We have a few other questions on EVs. Someone's asking, low-income people living in apartments usually don't have a garage to put an EV in. Many EV owners report that if an EV is left out in weather below zero, it won't start. So how could people find EVs that are more accessible and affordable to them? And I think it could be a two-part question. Like, do you think there will be technology that will ensure that these EVs are resilient to weather fluctuations?
Yeah. I do. So I think the US is very unlikely to, ban combustion engine cars for some of the reasons that, are alluded to in that question. I think it's going to be harder for a while for people who live in apartment buildings to have EVs. I think we'll see more adoption in the beginning in places like, the suburbs where you can charge at home and, never have to go to a gas station ever again. Um, the the cold weather, it's an issue for both EVs and combustion engines. There's some interesting data from Norway that we cite in our report that yes, cold weather makes the battery performance worse, but you're actually more likely to have a problem starting the car with a combustion engine than with an EV. But we are seeing, the equivalent of like heat pumps being incorporated into EVs that'll help them deal better with weather fluctuations.
Oh, that is super exciting. We only have a few more questions, if that's all right. Someone was asking, and this is a little outside of law, but maybe you'll know, Matt. Are there innovations in developments of batteries for EVs that are not reliant on lithium as part of the cells?
Yeah, and I think we talk about that in our report that there are some that use sodium ion, which would be huge because one of the concerns that we don't talk about because again our report is only focused on false claims, not all sorts of impacts, but there are a lot of concerns about where are the minerals coming from, things like cobalt that come from places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and so yes, there are alternatives emerging, and then even with our current models, there are innovations that are requiring less cobalt.
Wow, that's great. Research and development, I'm telling you, it's going to make things smoother. The last question is, why can't we get rid of golf courses and use them for solar farms? Why are we wasting water on lawns and golf courses during a water scarcity?
Yeah. I guess the real challenge is, who's the we? So both the UK and the US, we don't have, central planning where the federal government is saying, we're going to build solar here. We're going to, have a golf course here. It's all, private individuals. And it's often on private land. There are parts of the country where, like out west, there's a lot of federal land. So a lot of the solar projects there are on Bureau of Land Management land that's, it'll either be used for grazing or oil and gas or solar, sort of mixed use land. But in places like the Midwest, it's private land, and it's really the decision of the farmer who owns it whether to lease it out. So, this is, I guess my answer is just it's dictated by the market, and it's not central planning.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, that's it for questions. Thank you so much, Matt, for spending 10 extra minutes with us answering all these questions. It was so incredibly fascinating. I've got a bunch of questions about this report. So for those watching, I'm going to link the report in the YouTube. I can also put it on our Climate Live webpage for the Climate School. So you'll have a chance to read all 33 of these false claims and why they're false. And yeah, thank you, Matt, for joining us.
Thank you.